starting next week, next Wednesday, we have Monday off. Next Wednesday, I'll close the door so that way we don't have any distractions. If you're running late, no big deal. Watch the live stream or watch class later. Come on in. But at 7:30, starting next Wednesday, that door is going to close and we're going to get to work. All right. So I'll send out an email to let everybody a reminder. You know what's great about 7:30 in the morning? I know it's not great waking up. There's parking. Yeah. So it's a big compliment. All right, you guys. They're probably the most important lecture of the semester until I tell you that the next lecture is the most important lecture of the semester. I want to start off by saying we have rotational conversations. Remember last class I said there's a difference between translation and rotation. A lot of times, most of the time they happen together, so we have to extract what's up, down, left, right, front, back from what is spin. Planes, as you've ever been introduced to, is not the whole story of how we use it in human motion. In fact, most of the time, has everybody ever seen the cardinal planes and someone's standing right here? There's no movement at all, it's just a picture. Planes in our world is a conversation about spin. Objects rotate in a plane. Okay? We don't use the word planes for translational motion. We already have things for that. The X, the Y, the Z. A three-dimensional movie, right? You go see a movie in 3D, it means you can see it up, down, left, right, and depth. That's right. So starting off, planes is how we describe rotational motion. Okay? Now, there are similarities. Governed by different rules, but similarities. There's 3 dimensions of straight line motion, the X, the Y, the Z. But in each dimension, you can move 2 different ways. Interstate 10 technically is 1 road. But you could travel east and west in 2 different directions on that 1 road, right? Interstate 49, 1 road, but you can go east and west. You can go 2 different directions per plane. The x-axis is like a linear dimension, and I could go positive or negative. The y, the z. Rotational world's the same way, the same rules. We have 3 dimensions of spin, and we can spin 2 different ways in each dimension. That's what clockwise and counterclockwise means in the world of mechanics. I can spin, I can do a front roll or a back roll. Or I can do a cartwheel to my right or a cartwheel to my left. Or I can spin to my right, spin to my left. Okay? Let's start off with things that we are familiar with. And the first lesson I ever got in perspective, I was in 5th grade, all right, maybe 6th grade. And our social studies teacher, may he rest in peace, this Benji asked a friend of mine to stand up. And this was back when you could call students out. And Kevin was a good dude. He could have picked me, didn't matter. He said, Kevin, point north. And Kevin stood up and now, some of my, because we used to rib each other a lot growing up, so a lot of us laughed, but then I stopped and I was like, well, that makes a lot of sense why he said that. Because anytime you've ever seen the cardinal directions, like on a screen or on a board, north was facing up. Makes sense? So I thought about it, I was like, I can see why he said that. And so, point to the right. Well, who's right? You're right. My right? East is east, but if you keep going east, you're going to be in a point that you could have gone west. Like, it gets freaky, right? It gets a little weird. It gets a little weird. So perspective is very, very important. Eventually, I'm going to teach you that when you're analyzing movement, it has to be from the person you're observing's perspective. If somebody has an injured arm, it's their arm. In fact, having worked in surgery a little bit, more observation, they wouldn't let me touch anything when I was in grad school. But when they would operate on an arm, they would put a big X on the non-operating arm, just to say, do not touch this. Why do they put wearers of this costume won't be able to fly? Because someone accidentally did something and you have to warn against it. How many times a doctor's working long shifts, nurses working long shifts, they're exhausted, they're tired, it's an emergency, and the instructions are, as soon as you can, amputate right leg. Oops, cut off the wrong leg. I thought it was my right, it was their right. Here's a southern. So perspective is really important. Where is east? Well, just because the board says that's east doesn't mean that's really east. And again, if we were facing each other and I said point to the right, we would both point in two different directions. But to us, it's the same direction. Okay, with me so far? So in our world of anatomical kinesiology with human movement, our joints rotate. We talked about why, because it's the only way we can get motion without dislocating segments, right? We can't just move via translation. We're not magic. And with this movement comes general motion. Some of it's straight line, some of it's rotational. All we care about is the rotational, and I'll tell you why. Because those of you can see, I'm not really much of an artist, but you can imagine like a helicopter propeller rotating and we're looking down on the top of it, right? Well, if something's spinning clockwise, counterclockwise, you don't really pay much mind to all of the different levers, all of the different rigid links, because they're all kind of canceling each other out. You just see a blur, right? But what if we removed three and all we had was one? We just had one left and it spun the same way, but it was just one propeller, so it was going to wobble, right? It's kind of like you're trying to spin it back. And again, this is common sense stuff, but we need to awaken to linear and rotational. If I start to rotate this one propeller, linearly, it's going to start to go up and to your right. If it keeps spinning the same way, it's going to start to go down and to your right. And it keeps rotating the same way. Now it's going to be going down and to your left. And it keeps spinning the same way. Now it's going to go up and to your left. The linearity will always constantly change. That's like running around a track. You're going to transition from going east to northeast to north to northwest to west. Like you're going to constantly be changing linear direction, but you'll still have the same spin. Make sense? This was from Wednesday. I don't want to use linear words to describe rotational concepts. So what I do not want to do is learn or memorize flexion is when the hand goes forward. Because eventually I can keep flexing and the hand goes back. I don't want to say flexion of the wrist is when the hand goes forward. I am not ready to update. That's on my laptop, sorry. No, I do not want to update. All right. We do not want to say flexion of the wrist is when the hand goes forward. Because as you're going to see, I can rotate my radial ulnar joint. So now the front of my hand is actually facing the back of me. This is still the front of my hand. My fingernail's on the back. So just because I do this doesn't mean that now my fingernail's in the front of clasp, but not of the hand. This is still the back of the hand. This is still the dorsal surface of the hand. So we do not want to use what's comforting to us. Straight line verbiage is comforting to us. That's our Linus blanket. That's what we use the majority of the time. But it can get us into trouble. We do not want to use things like leg go forward. We don't want to use things like hand go forward, hand go back. We want to look at it from the perspective of the joint. Easy analogy I used on Wednesday. My thumb is on the lateral side of my arm when I'm in anatomical position. But if I pronate, now my thumb could be on the medial side of my arm. My thumb is still a lateral structure that happens to be visiting the medial part of my arm, the inside of my arm. My thumb didn't become a pinky, and my pinky didn't become a thumb, okay? So planes and axes are dimensions of rotation, dimensions of spin. 3 dimensions of straight line motion, 3 dimensions of rotational motion. What are those dimensions called? Sagittal, frontal, transverse. It's all about the spin. Part of the reason these kind of pictures get confusing is they're still pictures. They're static pictures. They don't spin for us. So if you print out your materials, you can spin them. The iPad, you move it around. So I got Ken guy here. He can spin in 3 different dimensions. So it's almost kind of like looking at it not as because it's tempting. Look at those slices of space. Up and down must be sagittal, or across must be transverse. Any up-down motion, imagine if those were panes of glass. Any straight line motion, you can make a case for it has to move in 2 different linear dimensions. I'll give you that sounds crazy, but I'll give you an example. You'd be, oh, that's what that dude's trying to say. If I shifted the table across, a lot of people may say, well, that's transverse. And I'd be like, well, why didn't you say it's frontal? It's moving just as much looking in that frontal slice than a cross slice. And if I move something forward, if I shifted this forward and you say, oh, that's sagittal, it's moving kind of in that slice of space. Well, it's also moving with the transverse. I mean, you cannot isolate one slice of space for any linear motion. But what you can do is single out a slice of space for rotation. When this person spins like this, it's only in this slice of space. Click, drag, spin. And we could spin in 2 different directions in each space. It doesn't matter if we're going here. If I'm trying to saw the board, does it matter if I start from the front to back or if I start from the back to the front? Like, the saw's still going to spin the same way. It's the only option. Sound effects are free. That's it. Does that make sense? Planes and axes are a rotational concept. Objects, including our joints, rotate in a plane. Plane just means rotational dimension. And things that spin have to spin about something. There must be a fulcrum, they say in mechanics. We just say an axis. You know, when they have a sign, 3 or more axles per, you can't pass. Those 18, they have multiple axes about which the tires are spinning, right? Objects rotate in a plane. Objects rotate about an axis. If I wanted to spin this piece of paper in this dimension, it's going to be about an axis. Now, here's what's really cool. If I want to change the plane of spin, I have to change the axis of rotation about which it spins about. Does that make sense? So in other words, if I want to start spinning here, I got to also move the axis to spin about. The paper can't spin like this. And the paper also can't spin like this. There's only one way the paper can spin about that pin. There's just one. And if I want to move it like this, that's it. Paper can't spin like this, and the paper can't spin like this. So an axis is a point about which things spin. You spin a basketball on your finger's the axis, and the ball's spinning in a plane. That plane. You take the ball and you spin it forward. My axis, the spin. You take a ball and you spin it like this, axis, spin. We have to give them names. There's the names: transverse, frontal, sagittal. My grandma used to call a cat, I didn't know if El Minu was a cat. I'm like, man, Mama's seeing things. She's talking about this creature. She's like, no, that's a cat. Oh, okay. What we call it sometimes might vary, but it doesn't change the concept. You know what? I've heard polar axis be called longitudinal axis. It will. It's the concept. It doesn't change the concept. I've heard some people refer to it as the fibula collateral ligament instead of the lateral collateral ligament. That doesn't mean they're wrong, just a different, sometimes a little variation in verbiage. Internal rotation, medial rotation. It's the same thing. It's important, though, that we are on the same page of what we call things so that there's no miscommunication, right? So that's why it's important, even if, well, in the clinic, we say this, that's awesome, but we have to be uniform for testing and application purposes on what we call things, okay? All right. If you don't mind, I'm going to close the door because a riot broke out. Those games can be aggressive. You know what's really aggressive? So my major professor at Auburn, she worked with wheelchair sports, like wheelchair basketball and rugby. Those boys and girls are some of the most aggressive people I've ever seen in my life. Like, they get after it. It's so awesome. Haven't spilled it yet? Yeah, let's see what time it is. All right, still got a long way to go. All right, you guys. So the easiest, some of you are going to see this differently. And guys, that is okay. I see motion based off of spin. I visualize like a helicopter. If my elbow is moving, I literally visualize, what if the arm kept going? It would spin like this. What if the arm kept spinning? It would spin like this. What if the arm kept spinning? It would spin like this. That's how I see it. Some people, and that's okay, it only matters how you get to the right answer. Some people don't see spin, some people see axis, some people see the view. Not the show, but the visual. In other words, some people will say, well, if I'm trying to look at rotation here, how would I want to see it? How would I want to view it? Because the axis kind of gives you a view. What I mean by that is, I'm going to come back, but like if you were going to watch a gymnast perform on the bar, you really wouldn't get a good view looking in the front. In other words, in the same view of the spin, you'd want to view it from the side. That makes sense? So if you're watching someone spin in a sagittal plane, the axis kind of has to be bilateral because you're watching it from the side. A bilateral view will give you a great view of sagittal spin. Anybody have younger sister, brothers, cousins, children, right? And they're always just like, watch this, oh my God, this is amazing. And I don't know, they do a squat or something, right? But if my youngest son is like, Dad, watch me do a cartwheel, and I know he's going to be doing his cartwheels like this, I'm not going to stand right there to watch it. If he's cartwheeling in the frontal dimension of spin, I kind of want to view it from his front back, his anterior posterior. That kind of shows you where the axis is to watch the movie, to watch the film. Some people see axis and then can see plane. Some people see plane and then can see axis. Do you see how it doesn't matter? It's like, okay, you type in an address on GPS and it gives you options to get there, but both options take the same amount of time. Some people may just want to take the easiest path. Some people I like country roads. You know, it doesn't matter as long as we get to the same place. Objects rotate in a plane. Objects rotate about an axis. So let's look at another example, sagittal, frontal, transverse. Sagittal plane spins rotate about a side-by-side axis. Now, think about how these axes got there. I like to think of how things get their name. It makes more sense to me. If I was going to, bilateral just means two sides. So if I was going to rotate anything in a sagittal dimension, let's say my shoulder, it would make sense that the view would be from one side to the other side. It would make sense that the fixed point would be through one arm and out the other. A bilateral fixed point. Like if I had a hula hoop and I could spin it in the sagittal plane about a bilateral axis. Kind of makes sense. Sagittal plane rotations about let me see if I can do this. My balance is not what it used to be. My balance was never what it is. Bilateral axis, sagittal plane rotation. And notice I don't want to use things like up, down, left, right, because I can spin and my leg go down and forward and then up and forward. It's about the spin. Sagittal plane spin about a bilateral axis. Sagittal plane spin about a bilateral axis. Sagittal plane spin about a bilateral axis. Yoink. Sagittal plane. In fact, those malleoli bones, that's a great indicator of bilateral axis. You got one on the inside and outside. Okay? Frontal plane rotations. That's going to be from a view from the front or the back, right? To watch frontal plane spins. We got a word for that. The AP axis means anterior, posterior, front to back. It's a front to back view. The pin or the imaginary axis doesn't go in one side and out the other side. It goes in the front and out the back. Anterior, posterior. So watch. Anterior, posterior axes are great views for frontal plane spins. Anterior, posterior axes, great views for frontal plane spins. Anterior, posterior axis, great planes for frontal plane spins, great views. Fixed point, rotation. Where's the axis of rotation then for a cartwheel? Your center of mass. And there's general motion there. Even though I'm doing a cartwheel to my right, like I'm linearly going to the right, I'm spinning while I do it, right? That's a wheel. It's like a wheel, rotating and translating. These are married concepts. And the divorce rate is 0. Sagittal plane spin, bilateral axis. Frontal plane spin, anterior, posterior axis. Transverse spin, polar axis. Frontal AP, sagittal bilat, transverse polar. Spin in the basketball, polar axis. So for my transverse, I showed you with the paper, right? The pin in the paper. So a polar axis, you think about how the Earth spins, right? About its poles. So a polar axis is going to allow transverse rotation. Middle finger is great for a radial ulnar joint because it pivots around the middle. Transverse plane spin about a polar axis. Okay? The key thing is these are terms for spin. These are terms for rotations. And it should make sense now why we don't want to use things like forward, back, side, side. Because it may not all line up. Abduction is this entire rotation of spin. Let me just do it with one arm. From your perspective, it would be like clockwise spin, right? My arm starts here. I go to 9. Clockwise rotation, right? From your perspective. Then I go to 12. Wasn't that still clockwise rotation? So from here to here is the same spin as from here to here. But some students are going to miss that on the test. And the reason is because they were like, well, we were taught abduction is away from the midline. Well, maybe to start, but eventually you come back. That's why we don't want to use linear terms for a rotational concept. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. It's all about spin, direction of spin. Okay? Now, so here's some examples. This one I do have to warn you. I couldn't do a view of the sagittal because again, right? So I had to give a side view so that you could see. So this would be like if I was trying to really line it up. This would be like doing a front roll here or there, but I couldn't find a picture that would illustrate you seeing a roll in the third dimension. Does that make sense? This one works out great because it matches your view. This one works out great because you could just imagine, the little girl spinning and rotating. So again, it's a limitation of a 2-dimensional fixed screen, sometimes trying to describe a 3-dimensional concept. But we got good. Any questions? Okay. So I also try to hit that point home with some of these examples with the pin and a CD, but you could use, the reason I use a piece of paper, you know, in case you don't have a CD, you can stick a piece of paper and spin and just kind of get used to, okay, that's a side to side, that's a sagittal, that's a frontal, that's an AP, that's a transverse, that's a pole. Unfortunately, these are the kind of things we're going to have to memorize, but it's no different than learning the rules of the game so that you could play and enjoy the game. All right, let's transition to perspective. Back to my friend Kevin. Kevin, point north. And I'm like, I might have done the same thing. I get it. So within dimensions of spin, we have perspective. You guys might have already been introduced to a form of perspective. Like in exercise physiology, they have like relative and absolute VO2. Or, you know, something relative to your body weight. Heck, boxing, MMA, they don't do that in track and field. You know, it's who throws the farthest or who runs the fastest. But in competitive wrestling, MMA, boxing, they make it relative to your body weight. It's not an absolute competition. It's relative. In mechanics, we have a term for relative, and that's global and local. But that's all it is. It's another version of absolute and relative. Okay? A global reference is a fixed reference that doesn't move, even though you may move. That's the heart. Remember how I took the heart and I was like, here's the superior vena cava, but if we flip it upside down, that doesn't become the inferior, right? Okay? It's absolute. This will always be the front of the classroom. It's fixed. It doesn't matter if I spin around and they say, point to the front of the classroom, I'm pointing this way. But if I'm facing here, point to the front of the classroom, I might have a different motion to do it, but my point is fixed. My point's the same. This will always be the front, that'll always be the back. So therefore, that'll always be one side and that'll always be the other side. This will always be the top, that'll always be the bottom. A fixed reference. In mechanics, we have things called global and absolute angles. I may have heard that before, where you have an angle of 20 degrees from the horizon or from the X, but just because I move the whole thing like this doesn't mean this angle changed, right? So globally it could have changed, but locally it didn't. Same kind of concept. The important thing to understand, the so what, I'm really trying to not go down rabbit holes and give you the so what. All of our joint motions are locally referenced from the joints themselves. It has nothing to do with the room. It has nothing to do with who's observing me. It's about each individual joint. Example, when I'm in anatomical position, I can establish planes, axes, what's lateral, what's medial, what's superior, what's inferior. That's the whole point of anatomical position. It's a universal starting point so that I can initially identify linear and rotational things. But once I get out of anatomical, in other words, my elbow in anatomical has a bilateral axis, side-to-side axis, that allows sagittal plane rotation. We'll get to what the spins are called later, but it's the concept, bilateral, sagittal. From my elbow's perspective, it's doing the exact same thing whether I'm here or whether I'm here. To my elbow doesn't know what the heck the front of the class is. My elbow doesn't know what top, bottom, left, right is. My elbow's like, I'm either spinning in the fetal or I'm spinning out of fetal. My elbow can only move in its sagittal plane. Its perspective. Because as I move my arm, the axis moves with it. It's like taking a globe. And if you have a globe and you know how you can spin the globe on its axis, right? Taking the globe and lifting up and moving doesn't change the fact that that's a polar axis for the Earth. The axis moves with it. On the test, some students will learn abduction is frontal plane, but then I'll give them a flexion and extension and I'll move the person and they'll be like, well, that must be frontal plane because the elbow's moving in the frontal plane. Global references can mess with us. Again, this goes up, that goes down. Well, what if I'm upside down? What if I'm hanging from a bar? What if I'm hanging from my legs? What if it doesn't have to always be robot work, is what I'm trying to get to, okay? So planes and axes can be globally referenced, the room's frontal, the room's sagittal, and that's gonna, guys, we use that a lot in coaching. You're not gonna tell a kid, planes and axes, kid, right? You're gonna use layman's terms, no problem. But to be better coaches, to be better fitness professionals, to be better allied health, we have to understand these differences so that you don't get fooled. You don't get tricked by thinking something happened and it didn't, or thinking something didn't happen and it did. Okay? So planes and axes are relative or locally referenced to the joints themselves. Okay? I'll put this slide in here to help mediate some common confusion with planes and axes. And that's like with imaging, X-ray, MRI. Some of you that work at clinics, they'd be like, well, I've heard them say, this would be a frontal, or that would be a transverse. And the key, or where I think some of these misunderstandings arise from, is, again, consistency of verbiage. What you're really doing is you're looking at a view. You're looking, that picture on the bottom left is a lateral view of the movie. Okay? That's a posterior view in the middle. That's a polar view over the top, but especially the transverse. They'll say a transverse slice or a transverse view. That's when things get a little freaky, because transverse is supposed to be for the spin. So in other words, it's just clinicians just playing a little fast and loose. In their world, it doesn't really matter. They know what they mean. But we really shouldn't say a transverse view, because that makes it look linearity. That gives it linear stuff. Transverse should specifically be for spin, and the view should be the polar. That's a polar view. That's a longitudinal view. In fact, it's no different when you get an X-ray. They may say, give me an AP lateral. That means an anterior posterior view and a lateral view. So they're pretty consistent when dealing with the anterior, posterior, basically the side and the front. But when they get to transverse, they just do not like to say, it's like apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. They'll give side view, front view, and then they'll use a plane for a view for the across. That gets some students confused. So all you got to take home is, anytime in our class we're talking about planes, it's a spinning conversation. How is something spinning? How is something rotating? When we're talking about views, that's an axial concept, a side view, front view, top view, bottom view. Right? AP. All right. Let me hit home a couple more points before we close out. So, objects rotate in a plane. An object can rotate in two different ways in a plane, just like we could travel two different ways on I-10 linearly. An object can spin two different ways in each plane. I can spin the basketball like this, or spin the basketball like that, but it's still spinning in the same dimension. It's still spinning in the same plane. Giving the basketball front spin or giving it back spin is the same plane, different rotations within the plane. You got two different spins in each dimension. The take-home point of that is, that's why we have terms that match up in each other's planes, flexions and extensions. Two different spins, same dimension. Ab and adduction. Same dimension, two different spins. Internal, external rotation. Same dimension, different spins. Ulna and radial deviation, two dimensions, same spins. Pronation and supination, same dimension, two different spins. Okay. All right, how about we do do some practice. Guys, this part of the class is not about identifying joint motions. This is about identifying planes of spin and associating the axis with the plane. The axis is going to be important for all of our joints because some joints are going to be uniaxial, doesn't mean that it moves about one. Some joints are going to be biaxial, can move about two. We got some that can be triaxial, can move like Southwest Airlines, move about the country, right? So this game is practice identifying a plane to an axis. Cheat, use the notes, right? Okay. These are all global questions to start off with. In other words, from 153B's perspective, it doesn't matter who's seeing it. How is it rotating based off of front to back, frontal, side to side, sagittal, top to bottom, transverse. Does that make sense? Okay, let's try this. What plane, from the room's perspective, is my cervical vertebra rotating in when I do this? Sagittal. Does it matter that I go this way or that I go that way? Nope, still sagittal plane. Still about side-to-side axis. What plane would my neck be moving in if I did this from the room's perspective? From the room's perspective. Now, even though it's my side to side, it's the room's front to back. From the room's perspective, from a global perspective. Remember, that means point north. It doesn't matter how I move my body, right? North is always going to be north. Up is up, down is down, side to side, front to back, globally, from a non-movable reference. When I say global in this class, it means the class. If we'd be in the gym, we'd have to define, well, where's the front of the gym? Where's the back of the gym? Where's the sides? Oh, we know we're up and down. Right? What about this one? The room's transverse. A global transverse. Now, from my perspective, my neck, my sides, my planes, all three were my sagittal. My sagittal. If I was blindfolded, I don't know I'm in the front or the back of the room. I don't know I'm nodding side to side. My neck's just like, I was doing the same thing each time. Both of them are correct as long as we communicate whose perspective. How many of you, my father-in-law was colorblind. Anybody else have a family member or yourself colorblind? Right? So an example of this analogy here would be if I asked my father-in-law what color was the carpet, and he said green, does that make him right or wrong? Well, technically it's not green. I don't know what the heck color that is. But he sees green. So how can he be wrong from his perspective? The key thing is what Mr. Melvin sees is his local reference, and what the world sees is a global reference. And I don't trick you guys. I play poker with my cards out, like I'm showing you my hand. I'm going to ask questions about planes and axes, but I will always give you the reference. From a global room perspective, you watch somebody do a cartwheel, and they're doing cartwheels like this. Well, to them, it's their side to side. But from the room's perspective, that would be like spinning like this from the classroom's perspective. The classroom doesn't care if it's a cartwheel or a front roll. The classroom's just like, are you rotating in my sagittal? Are you rotating in my frontal? Does that make sense? Perspective. Sagittal or frontal? Good. Global. I mean, well, sometimes global and local will line up. In fact, that's truly what anatomical position is supposed to be. Anatomical position is supposed to be where all of the things, global and local, all line up so that then once you move from that, you have a reference to communicate. Think of it like this. Someone's asking you for directions to something, right? Hey, I'm trying to meet up with you. What's the first question you can ask them? Where are you at? You have to know where they're at in order to give them context. We have to kind of have an idea of where everything's at first so that once we vary from that, we have references to discuss position changes in motion, right? So room sagittal and also my wrist sagittal. This is the medial side. This is the lateral side, side to side. This is the room's transverse, but it's still my wrist's sagittal. My wrist doesn't care about up, down, left, right, front, back of the room. My wrist is like if I interviewed my wrist, hey, wrist, did you do anything different here than you do there? And my wrist's like, I did the same thing. I left home and I went back home.
So do you think it would sometimes be easier, like if there's a picture where you're rotated like this, and you're asking about this, do you think it would be easier to start anatomical to see if it's sagittal and then?
That's a really great question. That is going to come in handy. I'm going to say put a pin in it. That's going to come in very handy when we go into more details about joint motion, trying to figure out if something's pronated or supinated, especially in these illusionary things. I'm going to give you tools to use references. Like I have a rule called the thumb rule, where in a supinated position, the thumb is lateral. A lateral structure is lateral to the arm. But when you're pronated, a lateral structure is now medial to the arm. So I will give you clues when we get into the rabbit hole a little more for specific motions that we can reference things in anatomical. But in this example, it really doesn't matter, right? It's ultimately just how is it spinning? And what I would hate to do is give you this and you change the question somehow by taking it out of that position. I'm protecting you from you. So there are going to be instances where we do want to reference things to anatomical, but we don't want to bring it to anatomical if it changes the question. So from the elbows perspective, it wouldn't change the question. This is sagittal, just like this is sagittal. But if I happen to test you on understanding a global reference, then this is an entirely different answer than this. Not from the elbows view, but from the room's view, from your view. Think of it like this. If you're watching me do this, this is your transverse. This is your sagittal. Yeah. So if you change it, it might change the question. But there will, to your point, there will be times where we have to bring things to anatomical to see things that may or may not have happened. Yes, sir.
In global reference, there obviously can be mixed claims.
What a great question. First of all, I need to shut up and let you finish. I just got excited.
I was wondering about like what they would be called.
Yes. Yes. Victory for the educational system. What do we know? We know linear. So what's our precedent? North, south, east, west, northeast, northwest, north, northwest, south, southeast. So the easiest thing from a global perspective, all sagittal. More and more frontal, less and less sagittal. All frontal. So in other words, this is a combination of sagittal and frontal. Some of it is spinning here, some of it is spinning there, and when we put those two together, we get a spin like this.
All three.
Oh yeah, and most motion has all three, absolutely. But just like we have to extract what is linear and what's rotation, I'm going to teach you these things. I'm going to teach you how to see more complex motion as, well, the joint can only do certain things in its sagittal. The joint can only do certain things in its frontal. The joint can only do certain things in its transverse. So when you see these complex motions that look overwhelming, you take a deep breath and say, the ankle can only do so many things. The knee can only do so many things. The hip can only do so many things. Now, when you move all the knobs, it looks crazy. But those are individual knob turns that I'm going to teach you how to drown out the noise, filter out the noise, filter it, and look at it for what it is. We analyze motion joint by joint. Each joint has its own rules of planes and axes. And once we narrow that down, it makes analyzing motion a lot easier. Think about this too. North, south, east, west. We live in a two-dimensional straight line world. The only time we go up and down is when like we go over an overpass, right, or under a tunnel. We don't ever talk about the up and the down when we're moving around. That's why for a compass, you don't have the up and down. It doesn't matter. Going up isn't going to get me closer to Colorado. But in rotational world, we always have that third dimension. That's another reason why I think people struggle with spin, because in straight line world, we only kind of have this bilinear. When you go to a movie screen, right, you just see up, down, left, right, and you kind of have to depth percept that third dimension. But that's exactly to your point. Northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, combination. So there is no such thing as a scapular plane. That's just a functional local term that says it's a combination of sagittal and frontal, and we're just going to give it a special name. The road is east, but we're going to call it Lilla Road. I mean, it doesn't make it there's no fourth dimension of rotation is what I'm trying to say. There's infinite combinations. But we are going to start basic. We are going to start with 8 set Crayola crayons, and we're going to move in those 3. Then eventually we'll gravitate towards combination stuff. Great question. Great question. Keep them coming. Keep them coming. Any other questions? They could be great, or they could be questions like when I was young. Like anytime a teacher, God, it was so annoying. A teacher would say, "Are there any questions?" I'd be like, "Hey, why giraffe neck like super long?" And the teacher would be like, "Oh my gosh, this is math." And I was just curious. Or like we'd be in English, and I'd be like, "Why can like a truck like do certain?" I just ask ridiculous stuff just to hear myself talk. I want y'all to do the same thing. Embrace the weirdness. Embrace early morning, and come with your questions, come with your clarifications. And a giraffe has the same amount of vertebrae as we do. That's freaky. Huh? Same, now they're bigger, but the same number of vertebrae as we do. That's going to be a test question. I'm joking. You have a good one, guys. We'll see you next Wednesday.